Well, for all you patriots who believe the national grid is our national grid, sorry, you are miles off the mark. So just who does own the national grid? I'm Dave. Welcome to Dave Takes It On. Stand by for a sorry but fascinating tale. When we look at the UK power scene, we have to go back to way before the Victorian era. 1812, in fact. Before Queen Victoria, that was King George III, Napoleon, Battle of Waterloo. Well, not for the launch of electricity, but natural gas. It was Frederick Windsor built the world's first commercial-scale gas grid, supplying UK homes, but mainly in London, gas for lighting and shortly afterwards for heating. And within 10 years, they were using that for more than 70,000 streetlights in London. Now, for all of you who say solar PV is a modern invention, it came next in the pecking order with Edward Becquerel discovering solar power via photovoltaic cells 1839. Wow! Cleveland, Ohio became the first anywhere in the world to use a windmill to generate electricity, and the first hydroelectric power plant opened in Craigside in the UK 1878. And the very first coal-fired power station opened in 1882. Well, initially for traditional tasks like lighting and heating, once electricity was made available in people's homes, its use spread. First was radios. The first transatlantic radio transmission was made down in Cornwall by Marconi. And John Logie Baird first demonstrated his TV in 1925. This was a golden age where Britain ruled the world. By the 1930s, electricity was everywhere, and in 1935, the national grid was formed when 7 separate regions joined together to supply the whole of the UK, based in Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Birmingham, London, and Glasgow. Energy instantly became more readily available and much cheaper. By the 1950s, the demand had expanded so much the grid could no longer cope with the expected future demand, so the new 275 kilovolt supergrid was created, and that was capable of upgrading to 400 kilovolts in the future. And in 1957, Central Electricity Generating Board was formed to provide the electricity to go into the grid to keep the lights on in the UK. But in 1990, the activities of the CGB were transferred to the National Grid Company plc, and in 1995, shares were traded on the London Stock Exchange, where it quickly expanded into the United States when it acquired the Rhode Island gas distribution network, trading under the Cadent brand that we know in this country today. Then the National Grid set off on a world buying spree, swallowing up Geronimo Energy, Western Power. They were buying and selling, merging and splitting, until we end up with what we have today, which, although I'll try and explain it, will probably be altered by the time this video is launched. Well, the first obvious statement, the UK National Grid is not UK owned or run, not remotely. It's not even British anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. Well, its shares have been sold around the world, and the shareholders ultimately own any publicly traded company. Those shares are held by many private investors, so in that sense we do still own a bit of it, just our own little bit. But mostly nowadays, as in the modern tradition, by investment organisation like banks, hedge funds, pension funds. The National Grid major shareholders include global investors, Vanguard Group, BlackRock Fund Advisors, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Norges, that's Norway, Investment Management, Merrill Lynch Bank, Legal and General Investment Management, Lazard Investment Manager. I think you can see the trend here in that the words investment manager or investment assets keep popping up over and over again. The truth is nobody actually owns the National Grid. That's divided up between about over 3 billion shares. So who actually runs the National Grid if nobody owns it? Well, we entered into the murky world of corporate business. You see, the shareholders, they're the ones who technically own the National Grid. they appoint a board of directors by voting at special meetings. That board of directors, in turn, appoints officers or managers to actually run the company. Board members can also be officers and managers themselves. Now, the shareholders cannot directly control the officers and managers, but they can vote out the entire board if the board, in their opinion, acts inappropriately. Well, at the head of the National Grid is CEO John Pettigrew, and he is indeed rather active. Besides being CEO of the Grid, he's also a non-executive director of Rentokil, a CEO of NG. He's on the board of Electric Power Research Institute and chairman of the National Grid Electricity Transmission and CEO of National Grid Gas. Wow, he's a busy man. But it's this complex financial and operational control that makes modern businesses, in this case the UK National Grid, so difficult to manage or control. Our UK government cannot control or order around the National Grid. They don't have that power. That power has long since gone. So what control do we actually have over our own National Grid? Well, no, it's not our own, is it? Well, we have Ofgem. This is a government organisation appointed by the government. They state that their main aim is to protect the interests of the UK population, especially vulnerable people. They're also there to stamp out bad practices, enable competition, and drive down prices and product services for the customers. Well, any marks for guessing how we think about that and that is panning out for them? Well, they are governed by the Gas and Electricity Markets Authority under powers provided by the Gas Act 1986, the Electricity Act 1989, the Utilities Act 2000, the Competition Act 1998, and the Enterprise Act 2002, and other measures set out in the Energy Acts. Their members are led by Chairman Mark McAllister, who has a very impressive record, past and present, then CEO Jonathan Brearley, and almost a dozen non-executive members. These all rule over Ofgem Senior Executive Committee, and its chief executive is, once again, Jonathan Brearley, ruling over half a dozen directors. Now, at this stage, I'll just give up analysing what we have, because this is just the National Grid. And all that's responsible for is accepting power into the grid and making sure it's transmitted around the country. It has no responsibility in making electricity, generating it and getting it into the grid. It's got no responsibility whatsoever for getting it out of the grid and into local substations. That task is carried out by DNO, distribution network operators, nor have they got any involvement whatsoever in getting it to the end users. That's us. That is the responsibility of the utility companies like EDF and Scottish Power. The part of the confusion comes from the some of them are all the same. The National Grid owns some DNOs, and some utility companies are also owners of the National Grid and own the DNO. It's so confusing. It's just an absolute mess. We blame the DNOs for lack of EV charging progress, but who runs them, you ask? Well, some of them are independent, but most of them are owned by the National Grid, and back we go to square one. Well, does anyone else out there think we've built up an absolute dog's dinner of corporate operation? Who actually controls or runs our electricity grid and supply? More importantly, how can we change it? What can we do if it doesn't any longer represent the people it is meant to represent, but instead seeks profits at their expense? The people, that is, not the grid. Well, the answer has to be the UK government. Whether or not they have any interest in using those powers, the government controls who can and can't operate in the UK, and under what terms. We have Ofgem, set up by the government, and they operate under UK laws to ensure the grid does what it says on the tin. If it's not able to do what it's meant to, then it has the power, Ofgem, to go back to Parliament and ask for a new law to be passed to change it. And we make these laws all the time. They're in finance, for example. Think investment protection, banking regulations, direct debit protection. These are all delegated authorities. The transport, we have laws to ensure safe motoring, safe vehicles, safe road standards. And if the government of the day decides we're not being served properly, then they can, and sometimes do, make changes. But here there is a very strong tradition of not rocking the boat and vested interests. Unless it is totally broken, they tend to leave it well alone. They also have an attitude, don't bite the hand that feeds you. The government collects massive revenue from certain sectors. That includes the power sectors. But ultimately, it is Ofgem that can make changes. And if it finds it doesn't have sufficient powers, they can ask for new laws. Unfortunately, we see incredible weak leadership in all of our governing bodies. Think of Ofwat. Our water regulator has recently been found to have allowed ecological disasters with release of sewage into freshwater supplies. And it's been happening regularly, hundreds of thousands of times a year. They've done nothing. Then think Network Rail. That's the equivalent governing body for our railway structure. Well, or lack of it. Think HS2, high-speed train. Well, it appears we've sold off all our assets over the years and they've grown, expanded to become multinational megaliths that control things but are not within our control. Or should I say that are within our control but they don't exercise any of that control. Well, I concentrate here on a very narrow section of Ofgem, the EV charging structure, and find it is totally unwilling to do what is being demanded of it. I know there are many who say don't interfere, leave it to the market, but the absolute obscene rise in electricity and gas prices recently, and the water pollution from unregulated spillages, shows exactly what happens if we do leave it to the market. Take the fossil fuel industry. The shareholders and directors actually have a legal duty to ensure that the companies do whatever is profitable in order to make a good return on shareholders' investments, even if that means destroying our environment or planet in the process. Corporate greed has been totally out of control for an awfully long time. Result is a world that is consuming its resources faster than it can replace them. It's also killing millions of people in that process. 50,000 people are estimated to die in the UK each year prematurely from exhaust fumes from our petrol and diesel cars. Well, to try to stop this from reaching its lethal conclusion, the world is finally trying to bring that under control. We now have net zero with a target of 2050. All the countries in the world are pledging to have zero CO2 net emissions by 2050. And you would think this is a good thing. It's not asking us to cut back on our energy usage, not asking us to give up things, far from it. It's actually growing the grid with renewable energy. But it's merely asking that we produce that energy so that it doesn't destroy ourselves or the planet. And that has to be a good thing. Well, to all those except making huge obscene profits at present from carrying on doing exactly what they're doing at the moment. Well, back to EVs. They are not perfect for all. They are not ideal for many, and in fact, no use to some people. But these are early days. They are getting better. I admit they do produce less pollution in their life cycle by a considerable margin, and that they do make excess pollution that they do from sourcing their materials and the production methods. But you see, what you've got to realise is that the material source and the production methods can be regulated by governments much more easily than trying to regulate us as individual producers of pollution. And the grid is a great example of that. It is almost impossible to force every single person to use energy better or less or whatever, or to use green transport. But if we force them to use EVs and at the same time transform the grid from fossil fuel to renewable energy only, then we will all, by default, be using green energy and no longer polluting our planet. And finally, for those who shout, well, we should stop subsidising the EV industry, let it survive on its own. Same with the charging infrastructure, don't interfere. But my answer is, you are hypocrites. Do you not realise that our governments have been very heavily subsidising the oil industry and fossil fuel industry for well in excess of 100 years? Seems strange that you're happy with that. Well, thanks very much for watching this video. If you have enjoyed it, please click the like button. And if you would, please subscribe. It makes such a difference to us as a new channel. If you click the bell icon, the notification, you'll be notified the next time we launch a video. And a massive, massive, massive thank you, last but not least, to our Patreon members. This side of the business is growing dramatically. We've had our most successful month ever, and thank you so much for your support for the channel. I'm Dave.